The wind cut through the valley like a relentless knife, and the skeletal remnants of stone walls jutted out from the frozen earth, silent witnesses to centuries of forgotten life. Amid these ancient ruins, one man stood with his coat pulled tight, staring at the landscape with a mixture of awe and determination. The local townsfolk had long abandoned this place, deeming it cursed or useless, and in winter, the desolate ruins became a place even birds avoided. Snow clung stubbornly to every surface, and the frost in the air sparkled cruelly under the pale morning sun. Yet to him it was barren. It was full of potential. Every stone, every weathered archway seemed to whisper secrets of an era when builders understood the land intimately, shaping structures that lasted centuries. The man, a figure both ordinary and extraordinary in the eyes of the nearby community, had been laughed at more times than he could count. His neighbors, cozy in their conventional cabins with thin wooden walls, had long considered him eccentric at best, foolhardy at worst. They saw him wandering these ruins, measuring stones with a tape and jotting down notes in a leather-bound journal, and shook their heads. Some called him obsessed, others simply labeled him a troublemaker, someone wasting time chasing impossible ideas. They did understand his vision, the way he could see beyond the cold and rubble to something far greater, a living space, not just built on land, but built into the very fabric of history itself. He adjusted the strap of his pack, feeling the familiar weight of tools and notebooks. Among the scattered ruins, he could already imagine walls rising again, not merely reconstructed but reimagined. He envisioned warmth in the midst of cold, comfort carved out of ancient stone, and the extraordinary possibility of living in a place where the past and present could coexist. His breath formed clouds that drifted across his face, and he closed his eyes briefly, picturing the cabin he would create, a modest structure nestled in the heart of ruins, blending seamlessly with their contours, a sanctuary against the harsh winter winds. Even as he dreamed, the reality of the challenge pressed in. Winter in this valley was merciless. Temperatures plummeted to levels that made ordinary cabins almost unlivable. His neighbors, snug in their heated homes, had often told him, "You'll freeze out there. Nobody survives long in that cold." Yet he was undeterred. He had spent months studying the ruins, walking the perimeter, taking detailed notes about the thickness of the walls, the orientation of the openings, the way sunlight hit certain stones at different times of the day. Where others saw decay, he saw insulation. Where they saw risk, he saw opportunity. Every crack in the stone and every slope of the ground told a story he could read, a language of survival written long before electricity or modern heating existed. The first steps toward building were not physical, they were mental. He spent hours sketching, measuring, calculating, imagining. He noted how some of the remaining walls faced south, receiving weak but crucial winter sunlight, while others offered protection against the bitter northern winds. He studied the layering of stones, some moss-covered and damp, some smooth from centuries of rain, and he knew that if he respected their integrity, they could form the foundation for a surprisingly warm interior. Unlike conventional construction, which relied on wood or thin panels, the ancient stones had thermal mass, the ability to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. He understood, in a way his neighbors could not, that the ruins were not simply old, they were functional, crafted by hands that had mastered climate, materials, and endurance. Despite the harsh cold, he began small. He cleared debris carefully, mindful not to disturb fragile sections, and moved stones that could be repurposed. His neighbors watched from the distance, peering through frost-covered windows, their laughter mingling with disbelief. "Why waste your time?" one shouted. "You will be buried in snow before the first night is over." Their skepticism stung at first, but he had grown used to it. He knew that true innovation often comes with ridicule. The hardest part, he realized, was not moving stones or shoveling snow. It was holding on to his vision when no one else could see it. Nights were the most difficult. When the temperature dropped to extremes, he would sit by a small fire outside the ruins, wrapped in thick blankets, planning the next day's work. He documented everything meticulously: wall thicknesses, angles of sunlight, wind patterns, and even subtle differences in how frost accumulated on different stones. Each observation became a thread in a tapestry of design, guiding how he would eventually transform the ruins into a cabin. Sometimes exhausted, he would lie awake staring at the stars, imagining the cozy interior he was building entirely in his mind. The thought of warmth, trapped and held by centuries-old stone, became a beacon that kept him moving forward. By mid-morning, the ruins often glowed faintly in the winter sunlight, casting long shadows across the snow. He could see it all in detail: the arches that could be stabilized, the corners that could form rooms, the wall thick enough to hold heat, and the openings that could provide light without letting in the bitterest wind. He mapped the space in his journal with a precision that bordered on obsession, aware that any miscalculation could cost him weeks or months in the bitter cold. He imagined a hearth nestled in the center, its heat radiating outward, absorbed by the stone walls, and slowly warming the cabin. In his mind's eye, the warmth would linger long after the fire had gone out, a silent testament to the ingenuity of the ancient builders and his own careful planning. Throughout the valley, rumors of his project spread. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, imagining him freezing in the ruins, a man defying logic and nature. Yet he felt no doubt. There was a rhythm to the work, a logic rooted in centuries-old architecture and modern calculation. He spoke often to himself while working, reasoning aloud about structural integrity, insulation, and heat flow, a solitary companion to the empty ruins. Every time he tested a small idea, stacking stones in a particular way, positioning a slab for maximum sun exposure, he recorded the results, learning incrementally, adapting, refining. Even the wildlife seemed to acknowledge his persistence. Birds, scarce in winter, occasionally landed on the higher stones, pecking at seeds hidden under snow, and a fox once observed him from the edge of the forest, tilting its head as if curious about his unusual activity. He smiled at these small confirmations, understanding that life in the valley was harsh, but responsive to those willing to engage thoughtfully with it. The ruins were not simply stones, they were part of an ecosystem, a microcosm of climate, shelter, and survival. And he was learning to work with it rather than against it. By the end of the first week, he had cleared a central area and begun placing the initial layers of stone for what would become the foundation of his cabin. Each movement was deliberate, each stone a choice informed by observation, instinct, and calculation. The cold gnawed at his fingers, his breath froze in the air, and snow drifted into his worksite, but he persisted. As evening fell, he would step back and look at the structure forming amidst the ruins, imagining the warmth it would hold when finished. Even in the coldest moments, hope flickered brighter than any fire. Neighbors continued to laugh, shaking their heads as they went about their warm, ordinary lives, unaware that the man in the ruins was observing them as much as they observed him. He understood their disbelief. It was easier to mock than to imagine a cabin thriving where logic suggested it could not. Yet he also understood something they could not. The ruins had already survived centuries of harsh weather, and with careful guidance, they could shelter him too. His vision was not about defying nature, but about learning from it, reading the subtle language of stone, wind, and sun, and translating it into a living, breathing space of warmth. By the time the sun sank behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across snow and stone, he packed away his tools and sat briefly on a cold boulder, surveying his progress. The ruins no longer seemed desolate, they felt alive. Each stone held a story, each wall a promise. And in the quiet, he made a silent vow: this cabin would not only withstand the winter, it would thrive in it. His neighbors' laughter, once sharp and cutting, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. He was building something that went beyond ridicule, beyond doubt, beyond cold. He was building warmth in the heart of history, and no amount of winter wind could take that away from him. The morning was frigid, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into every bone and linger there long after the sun had risen. Snow crunched underfoot as he walked carefully along the ruins, notebook tucked under his arm, eyes scanning every stone and every slope with a precision that came from months of observation. Today, unlike the previous weeks of clearing debris, would be a day devoted entirely to planning. He knew that the success of the cabin would not come from brute force or haphazard construction. It would come from understanding the ruins, respecting their structure, and harnessing their natural thermal properties to keep the interior warm despite the merciless winter outside. He stopped before a partially standing wall, its stones uneven but remarkably thick. The neighboring villagers had long called these ruins useless, a remnant of something they neither respected nor understood, but he saw the possibilities immediately. He crouched, running a hand over the rough surface of the stones, feeling the faint residual warmth from the weak sunlight, imagining how that same wall could act as insulation, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. He took out a tape measure, marking the height and width of each segment, noting irregularities that could be advantageous if carefully incorporated into the cabin's design. In his journal, he drew precise diagrams, labeling walls according to orientation and thickness. South-facing walls, he noted, would receive sunlight during the few hours it appeared over the horizon, while northern walls provided shelter from icy winds that cut through the valley like knives. Every gap, every crack, every crumbling arch became a variable in his planning. He understood that these ancient stones had survived centuries of harsh weather because their builders had intuitively mastered thermodynamics long before modern science existed. If he could harness that wisdom correctly, he could create a space that would remain significantly warmer than the surrounding environment, even during the coldest nights. As he mapped the ruins, he envisioned the layout of the cabin in 3 dimensions, imagining pathways through the uneven terrain, corners that could become rooms, and small alcoves that could serve as storage or niches for sleeping. He marked areas where stones could be reinforced, walls that could be slightly rebuilt to provide extra support, and spaces where insulation could be added without disrupting the ancient structure. The planning process was meticulous, almost ritualistic. He drew, measured, erased, and redrew, constantly checking angles and proportions. The cabin was just going to be functional. It had to integrate seamlessly with the ruins, so that it appeared not as an addition, but as an extension of the ancient design itself. Neighbors occasionally passed by on the road that skirted the ruins, and he could hear their voices carried faintly through the cold air. "You were wasting your time," one called, a sneer in his tone. "That place is even safe. You'll freeze before you finish." But he barely registered their words. He had learned long ago that ridicule was a constant companion to anyone willing to defy conventional thinking. The ruins, silent and steadfast, were his allies, and they did mock him. He returned to his measurements, recording the exact thickness of walls, the spacing between stones, and the alignment of the ruins relative to the sun's path. One of the most critical aspects of planning was deciding how to incorporate modern elements without compromising the integrity of the ancient structure. He imagined a small hearth at the heart of the cabin, its heat radiating outward, absorbed by the stones and slowly released into the interior. Ventilation had to be carefully considered. Too much and warmth would escape, too little, and smoke or condensation could accumulate. He sketched diagrams of airflow, taking into account the natural gaps in the walls, the positioning of windows, and even the slope of the roof, which would eventually be covered with reclaimed timber and insulated with layers of moss and stone dust. The more he planned, the more he realized how much the ruins themselves dictated the design. Unlike a blank canvas where one could impose arbitrary shapes and dimensions, the cabin had to adapt to the existing structure. He discovered that a partially collapsed arch could serve as the main entrance if reinforced, that a corner with slightly thinner walls could become a cozy sleeping nook, and that natural depressions in the ground could help with drainage and insulation. Every decision required both creativity and scientific reasoning, blending intuition with observation and calculation. He spent hours each day moving between sections of the ruins, taking notes on how the temperature varied in different areas, even during the short winter sunlight hours. One wall, partially shaded, remained several degrees colder than the others, while a sun-facing corner held a faint warmth that lingered even after the sun disappeared behind the mountains. He realized that by aligning sleeping areas and the main living space with these warmer sections, he could maximize comfort without relying on excessive firewood or artificial heating. His journal quickly became a compendium of observations, calculations, and sketches, a map for a cabin that existed first in his mind and only later in reality. The planning also included materials and tools. He carefully cataloged stones that could be reused, timber that could be salvaged from nearby fallen trees, and moss or clay that could be layered for insulation. Unlike modern construction, which relied heavily on uniform materials and nails, his approach demanded adaptability. Every stone had to fit precisely, sometimes with minor adjustments, and each piece of timber had to be shaped to conform to uneven surfaces. The ruins dictated the parameters, and he was learning to work within them rather than attempting to impose a rigid, conventional design. Evening brought a different set of challenges. As temperatures dropped, he would sit inside a small makeshift shelter near the ruins, reviewing notes, sketching additional ideas, and reflecting on the logistics of construction. He had to consider the order in which walls would be reinforced, how to safely move heavy stones without damaging ancient masonry, and how to protect partially cleared areas from snow and ice. Each question led to several possible solutions, and each solution required careful evaluation. His mind never rested, always turning over possibilities, weighing risks, and imagining the final structure in vivid detail. Occasionally, he would test small experiments to validate his ideas. He built miniature sections of walls using stones from the ruins, layering them with moss and clay, and then monitored how heat from a small fire was absorbed and released over several hours. These tests informed his planning, teaching him which techniques would be most effective for insulation, structural integrity, and airflow. The ruins themselves became both teacher and blueprint, revealing secrets that had been hidden for centuries. As the week wore on, the complexity of the project became clearer, but so did its feasibility. He could see the contours of the cabin forming in his mind. Thick stone walls that trapped warmth, cleverly positioned openings that allowed light but minimized heat loss, and a hearth at the center whose glow would radiate outward. The design was no longer abstract, it was becoming tangible, a synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern ingenuity. He imagined waking in the early morning to the faint glow of dawn filtering through carefully positioned windows, the interior warm while outside the wind howled across the valley. Neighbors. Curiosity began to grow even as their skepticism persisted. Some would slow their carts as they passed, peering toward the ruins, whispering to each other about what he might be doing. Others left notes, advising him to reconsider, warning of danger, or offering unsolicited advice about heating techniques and cabin designs. He read these notes but did not respond. The planning required focus, and external opinions, no matter how well-intentioned, were often distractions. His evenings were filled not just with technical planning, but with reflection on why he had chosen this particular project. Memories of harsh winters from childhood, of frost biting through thin walls, of nights spent shivering in inadequate shelters, drove him forward. He wanted not only to survive, but to create a living space that could demonstrate the principles he had studied, that could merge the knowledge of the past with the needs of the present. The cabin would be proof that careful observation, respect for natural structures, and patience could yield comfort in even the most unforgiving environments. By the end of the second week of planning, the framework of the cabin had taken shape in his journal. He could trace the outline in his mind, step through the imagined rooms, and see exactly how each element contributed to warmth and structural stability. Walls, roof, floor, and hearth were all mapped, every stone and beam accounted for. The more he refined the plan, the more confident he became that when the first physical layer was placed, the cabin would not only be viable, it would thrive. As the sun set behind distant mountains, he paused to look at the ruins in their winter isolation. The stones seemed to gleam faintly, as if approving the care with which he had studied them. The wind, once harsh and cutting, now felt like a challenge to be met rather than an obstacle. In his mind, the cabin already existed, warm, secure, and blending seamlessly into the ruins, a testament to centuries of wisdom and one man's perseverance. And though his neighbors still laughed and doubted, he knew that when the work began, the ruins would keep their secrets. No longer the warmth they could offer would soon speak louder than ridicule or skepticism. The morning arrived crisp and clear, the sky painted in pale streaks of pink and gold. But the chill of the valley reminded him that winter's grip was still unrelenting. Today was not about planning or imagining. Today, he would start building in earnest. The ruins, silent witnesses for centuries, seemed almost alive as he approached, as if acknowledging that their contours would finally be given a purpose beyond abandonment. He carried his pack, filled with hand tools, measuring devices, rope, and small supplies, moving carefully over the uneven terrain. Snow crunched underfoot, and the cold wind cut through the layers of his coat, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused, each step measured, each stone considered for its potential in the structure he had envisioned for weeks. He began by inspecting the most stable sections of the ruins. The walls, though ancient and weathered, retained remarkable strength. He ran his hands over the cold stone, feeling the subtle variations in texture, some smooth from centuries of rain, others rough with moss and lichen. He imagined how each could serve as insulation or structural support. In one section, a partially collapsed arch caught his attention. By reinforcing it with carefully positioned stones and mortar he had prepared himself, it could serve as a doorway that blended seamlessly into the ruins, maintaining both form and function. He made precise sketches in his journal, noting which stones could be reused, which needed to be replaced, and where additional support was required. The first challenge was clearing debris. Broken stones, fallen timber, and layers of snow and frost covered much of the worksite. Each piece had to be removed carefully, both to avoid injury and to ensure that reusable materials were preserved. He worked systematically, moving one section at a time, cataloging each stone by size, shape, and potential purpose. Some of the stones were heavier than he could lift alone, requiring him to engineer simple pulley systems using rope and nearby tree limbs. As he worked, he marveled at the ingenuity of the original builders who had moved these same stones centuries ago without modern tools. He realized that patience and respect for the materials were as important as physical effort. The neighbors, as usual, had gathered at the edges of the property, watching from a safe distance. Some whispered, some laughed openly. "He'll never finish," one called, shaking his head. "That place will collapse on him before winter is over." He ignored them, as he had learned long ago that skepticism was unavoidable, and that true innovation often attracted ridicule. The ruins themselves seemed more supportive than the voices of those who could not imagine warmth emerging from stone. He focused on the task at hand, each action deliberate, each movement considered. Once the debris was cleared, he began laying the foundation. Using stones salvaged from the ruins, he constructed the initial layer carefully, ensuring that each stone fit snugly against the next. He reinforced weak spots with a mixture of clay, sand, and moss, creating a natural mortar that would allow the walls to retain heat while remaining breathable. He paused frequently to check alignment, angle, and stability, knowing that a single misstep could compromise the structure. The process was slow, methodical, and exhausting, but with each stone placed, the vision of the cabin became a little more tangible. The construction process demanded ingenuity at every turn. Some stones were irregular, requiring him to shave or chisel edges to fit precisely. Others were fragile, needing careful handling to prevent breakage. He constructed temporary supports for sections that were unstable, ensuring that work could continue safely. Occasionally, he paused to observe how sunlight fell on the site, determining which walls would receive warmth during the brief daylight hours and adjusting placements accordingly. The ruins dictated much of the design, and he learned to adapt constantly, blending ancient structure with his own ideas for modern comfort. Daily routines were grueling. He rose before dawn, often shivering in the bitter air, and worked until the sun dipped low behind the mountains. Even with layers of clothing, frost would sometimes bite through his gloves, and the cold would make his muscles stiff and sore. But the thought of a warm, secure cabin kept him moving. He took short breaks to eat simple meals, often cold, yet nourishing enough to sustain him through the labor. At night, he huddled in a small temporary shelter, reviewing notes, sketching additional plans, and preparing tools for the next day. The ruins, silent and unwavering, provided a sense of stability and continuity that no temporary shelter could offer. As the walls began to rise, the effect was immediate. The interior of the forming cabin felt slightly warmer than the outside air, a result of the stone. Its thermal mass absorbing the day as weak sunlight. He noted this carefully, adjusting the placement of stones and layering additional insulation where necessary. Small tests with a controlled fire demonstrated that heat could be retained effectively, validating weeks of careful planning. The results were subtle but encouraging, a proof of concept that reinforced his resolve to continue despite the harsh conditions. Neighbors? Reactions evolved as they observed progress. Some were still skeptical, murmuring about waste and futility, but others could not hide their curiosity. Children would peek from behind fences, wide-eyed, asking questions that their parents dismissed. Occasionally, a more daring neighbor would approach, offering cautious advice about construction techniques or insulation. He listened politely, sometimes incorporating useful suggestions, but always maintaining the integrity of his own plan. The cabin had to be a careful balance between ancient principles and modern safety, and no amount of external pressure would compromise that balance. Weather presented constant challenges. Snowstorms would occasionally sweep through the valley, forcing him to reinforce partially built sections and protect vulnerable areas with temporary coverings. Wind, strong and relentless, threatened to dislodge loose stones and scatter tools, requiring constant vigilance. Yet each challenge was also an opportunity to test the durability of his designs and improve his techniques. He learned to position walls to deflect wind, to layer insulation to prevent heat loss, and to make the structure resilient against winter's unpredictability. Every setback was met with careful adaptation rather than frustration, and slowly, the cabin began to take shape. The physical labor was matched by intellectual effort. He continually refined his understanding of the ruins, thermal properties, experimenting with layering techniques, airflow management, and strategic placement of the hearth. By placing stones in particular configurations, he discovered that warmth from a small fire could be trapped and radiated evenly throughout the space. He adjusted wall thickness, added small alcoves for heat retention, and even experimented with insulating floors using layers of moss, stone, and timber. Each adjustment brought measurable improvement, and the cumulative effect promised a cabin that would remain surprisingly warm despite the freezing conditions outside. Construction also demanded creativity in using available materials. Stones of irregular shapes were carefully selected and trimmed to fit. Timber from nearby fallen trees was repurposed, and moss, clay, and sand provided natural insulation. He invented simple tools and jigs to move heavy stones safely, relying on leverage, pulleys, and ingenuity rather than brute strength. Every day was a test of skill, patience, and perseverance, and each success reinforced his confidence that the cabin would not only survive but thrive in winter. As the structure neared its initial completion, the form of the cabin became recognizable. The walls, thick and stable, outlined rooms and corridors, the central hearth, location marked, and strategic openings positioned to capture sunlight while minimizing heat loss. Even in this incomplete state, the interior felt protected from the wind and cold, a tangible proof of his meticulous planning and labor. He paused frequently to imagine the final space, a warm, secure retreat, blending seamlessly with the ruins, where ancient stone and modern ingenuity coexisted in harmony. By the end of the third week of construction, the cabin had taken shape in a way that surprised even him. What had begun as a vision in a journal was now a tangible structure rising proudly from the snow-covered ruins. The neighbors, initially derisive, began to murmur among themselves, curiosity slowly replacing skepticism. They could see the walls, the hearth, as planned location, and even the subtle layering of stones that promised warmth. Some ventured closer, still cautious, but unable to deny the progress. The ruins, long abandoned and silent, had been transformed into a space of purpose, guided by careful observation, patient planning, and unrelenting effort. Evenings were quieter, though no less important. As the sun set behind distant peaks, he would sit inside the partially constructed cabin, watching how the air shifted, how warmth lingered around the stone walls, and how shadows played across the interior. He documented every observation, adjusting future plans, and marking areas that required reinforcement or additional insulation. These nights of reflection and analysis were as critical as the labor itself, ensuring that when winter, as harshest nights arrived, the cabin would perform exactly as envisioned. Through the physical toil and mental effort, he grew increasingly attuned to the ruins, sensing their subtle cues, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and learning to work with them rather than against them. The process was as much about listening to the past as shaping the future, a dialogue between centuries-old stone and a modern mind. Each stone placed, each wall reinforced, and each experiment with heat and insulation was a step toward realizing a cabin that would defy expectation and provide comfort in the heart of winter. By the fourth week, the main structure of the cabin was complete. Walls stood firm, insulation layered between stones, the hearth positioned centrally, and openings carefully measured to balance light and warmth. The space already retained a noticeable difference in temperature compared to the surrounding ruins, a small but promising sign of the success to come. He surveyed the work exhausted but exhilarated, understanding that what had begun as a solitary dream was now a tangible reality. The cabin was no longer just a plan, it was a living, breathing structure capable of sheltering him from the harshest elements of winter. The first snowfall of the season came without warning, a gentle flurry that quickly turned into a relentless white storm, blanketing the ruins in a thick layer of frost. The valley had transformed overnight. Every archway, every stone, every footprint from his earlier work was covered in a seamless layer of snow, making the landscape appear both beautiful and forbidding. The wind whistled through gaps in the ruins, carrying with it a biting chill that seemed determined to drive intruders from the valley. He stood at the edge of the cabin, wrapped in thick layers, watching the storm unfold. Even from a distance, the partially built structure radiated a sense of stability, its thick walls promising shelter from the merciless weather. For weeks, he had imagined this moment, the first real winter test of the cabin. Now it had arrived, and with it, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had worked tirelessly to reinforce the walls, layer insulation, and carefully position openings to maximize warmth retention. But imagining comfort was different from living within it. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders, carrying the few essentials he would need for the night, a small supply of firewood, basic cooking tools, and blankets. The door, an arch reinforced with carefully placed stones, welcomed him into the cabin like a threshold between two worlds, one bitterly cold and hostile, the other warm and protective. Stepping inside, he immediately noticed the difference. Even without a fire, the walls retained the faint heat of the weak winter sunlight that had filtered in during the day. The thermal mass of the stone absorbed every degree of warmth, holding it in place and slowly releasing it into the interior. He smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of months of planning and labor. This was the moment he had anticipated, proof that careful observation of the ruins, combined with meticulous planning, could yield results that seemed impossible to the skeptics outside. The first priority was the hearth. He positioned a small fire at the center of the cabin, feeding it slowly with carefully split logs. The flames crackled and danced, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and within minutes, the warmth began to radiate outward. He observed how the heat was absorbed by the thick walls, spreading slowly and evenly throughout the interior. The air, though still tinged with the sharp scent of smoke, felt alive with energy, a stark contrast to the biting cold beyond the stone threshold. He monitored the temperature with a simple thermometer, noting that within half an hour, the interior had warmed several degrees, far surpassing the ambient air outside. Living inside the cabin required careful adaptation. Every surface had been considered for its potential to trap warmth. He placed blankets strategically along stone benches, using them as seating and sleeping areas. Small alcoves in the walls, which had been planned as storage spaces, now functioned as micro-environments where heat lingered longest. Even the floor, layered with moss, timber, and additional stones, provided insulation from the freezing ground beneath. The careful balance of stone and organic material, refined through weeks of planning and labor, created an environment that felt almost unnatural in its comfort, especially considering the harsh conditions outside. Meals were simple, cooked over the hearth. The smell of roasting meat and simmering vegetables filled the cabin, mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of stone and moss. The process was meditative, allowing him moments of reflection amid the laborious task of survival. He observed how heat radiated from the fire, noting which areas retained warmth longer, which surfaces absorbed it most efficiently, and how slight adjustments in placement could improve comfort. These observations would inform refinements in the cabin's insulation and layout, ensuring that each degree of warmth was maximized. The night brought its own challenges. Temperatures outside plummeted, dropping well below zero, and the wind intensified, rattling stones and rattling the skeletal remnants of the ruins around the cabin. Yet inside, the contrast was remarkable. The interior remained significantly warmer, a steady difference of nearly 20 degrees compared to the outside air. He monitored the cabin closely, recording every fluctuation, noting the thermal response of walls, floors, and alcoves. The results were consistent, proving that his combination of ancient stone and modern planning could create a shelter that not only survived the cold but thrived in it. Sleep, when it came, was both restorative and cautious. He curled in a sleeping nook near the central hearth, blankets layered around him, feeling the subtle warmth radiating from the stone walls. Outside, the wind howled like a living creature, rattling against the ruins, but inside, the temperature remained steady, comfortable, and surprisingly stable. He drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally waking to monitor the fire, adjust logs, or ensure that ventilation allowed smoke to escape without compromising heat retention. Each night became a cycle of observation, adaptation, and learning, transforming the cabin into a living experiment in survival architecture. Days merged into nights, and the first week passed with remarkable success. The cabin proved resilient, maintaining warmth despite snowstorms and bitter winds. He began documenting patterns, noting which walls absorbed sunlight most effectively, how heat distribution varied based on placement of the hearth, and the subtle effects of insulating materials layered between stones. These details, recorded meticulously, were more than observations. They were a blueprint for future improvement and for demonstrating to others how ancient structures could be adapted for modern survival. Neighbors began to take notice in ways he had not anticipated. Children, emboldened by curiosity, would approach cautiously, peeking around the ruins to see if the rumors of warmth were true. Some adults, skeptical yet intrigued, ventured closer, observing the smoke rising from the hearth, the faint glow of light from within, and the man's movements inside. Whispers began to circulate. Perhaps the cabin was more than eccentricity, more than folly. Perhaps it was a demonstration of knowledge, ingenuity, and patience that exceeded conventional wisdom. He did not encourage attention. He remained focused on his observations, knowing that proof would come not from words, but from measurable warmth and enduring comfort. The interior became increasingly refined over the following weeks. He experimented with airflow, opening and closing small vents to ensure that smoke escaped efficiently without allowing heat to dissipate. He tested the effects of layering additional moss, clay, and timber along walls and floors, observing subtle increases in retained warmth. Each experiment was recorded, measured, and incorporated into future adjustments. The cabin evolved not through guesswork, but through meticulous trial, observation, and adaptation, demonstrating the power of careful design informed by both ancient techniques and modern reasoning. The psychological impact of the cabin as success was profound. Nights spent within its walls provided not only physical warmth, but also a sense of security and accomplishment. He reflected on the months of preparation, the laborious construction, and the persistent skepticism he had faced from neighbors and observers alike. The ruins, once silent and abandoned, now bore witness to a transformation, a structure that combined historical insight with personal ingenuity, capable of sustaining life even in extreme conditions. Each morning, as he stepped outside, he observed the stark contrast between the frigid exterior and the steady warmth he had cultivated inside, a tangible measure of his success. The cabin, as first winter test, also revealed subtleties he had not anticipated. Slight variations in stone composition affected thermal retention. Small cracks in walls allowed drafts that could be sealed with moss or clay, and the placement of personal items within alcoves subtly influenced comfort. He adapted continuously, responding to these observations with precision, reinforcing weak points, and experimenting with new configurations of insulation and airflow. The process was iterative, a combination of science and intuition that required constant attention and thoughtful adjustment. Despite the harsh environment, he found moments of quiet beauty within the ruins. Snow drifted against the outer walls, glinting like crystal in the pale sunlight, and the occasional bird ventured close to the structure, pecking at seeds or perched on the higher stones. Inside, the cabin radiated warmth not only in temperature but in atmosphere, a refuge from winter's cruelty. He marveled at the way centuries-old stone, when combined with careful design and respect for natural processes, could create a space that defied expectations, transforming the ruins from desolation to shelter. By the end of the first month, the results were undeniable. The cabin consistently remained 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, even during the coldest nights. The thermal mass of the stone, combined with layered insulation, strategic placement of openings, and careful management of the hearth, had created a self-sustaining environment. He recorded these results meticulously, documenting temperatures, heat retention, airflow patterns, and adjustments made during the month. The evidence was irrefutable. The cabin worked. Neighbors. Skepticism began to waver. Some ventured closer, inspecting the structure without interference, noticing the subtle adjustments and improvements that demonstrated careful thought and expertise. A few brave individuals asked questions, curious about techniques, materials, and principles. He answered cautiously, offering glimpses into the process without revealing all details, preferring that results speak louder than explanation. The cabin had become a quiet ambassador for innovation, a demonstration that ancient structures could be adapted for modern survival in ways that were both efficient and sustainable. He spent long nights observing the fire, noting how heat circulated and lingered. The cabin became a laboratory, every stone and alcove a variable in an ongoing experiment. Adjustments were made methodically, additional insulation where drafts were detected, rearrangement of logs for optimal airflow, repositioning of blankets and sleeping surfaces to maximize comfort. The cumulative effect was profound. Even during blizzards, the cabin maintained a steady, livable temperature, providing a stark contrast to the frozen landscape outside. By midwinter, he realized the significance of what had been achieved. The cabin was not merely a shelter, it was a proof of concept, a demonstration that patience, observation, and respect for natural structures could overcome extreme environmental challenges. Every decision, from stone selection to hearth placement, had contributed to this outcome. The ruins, once forgotten and derelict, had been transformed into a space of warmth, security, and life. He knew that this winter, unlike previous ones, he would experience comfort and protection in a way he had never imagined possible. Winter had settled deep into the valley, draping the surrounding hills in a seamless blanket of snow. Yet inside the cabin, nestled within the ancient ruins, warmth lingered steadily. News of the cabin, as extraordinary performance, had begun to trickle through the small community, carried by whispers along the narrow roads and by the curious glances of those who passed by. At first, the tales were dismissed as exaggeration, the ramblings of an eccentric man who had spent months laboring in the snow and stone. But as more villagers observed smoke curling from the hearth, lights glimmering through the windows, and the subtle but unmistakable signs of life in the ruins, skepticism gave way to curiosity. The first to approach were children, emboldened by innocent fascination rather than adult caution. They crept along the edges of the property, peering around the reinforced archway that served as the cabin as doorway. Their eyes widened as they glimpsed the interior, faintly illuminated by the hearth fire, with walls that seemed impervious to the freezing air outside. They whispered excitedly to one another, unable to contain their amazement, and ran home to share their stories. Within days, more children arrived, some carrying scraps of firewood or small gifts, eager to see the cabin for themselves. The protagonist greeted them warmly, answering their questions patiently and explaining how the warmth was trapped by the ancient stone walls. Their wonder and excitement were infectious, and soon even the adults could not ignore the growing legend. The neighbors' initial skepticism began to waver when a few courageous adults ventured closer. At first, they lingered at the edges, arms crossed and expressions wary. But curiosity drew them in, and before long, small groups had gathered near the cabin, observing the man, his careful work, and the structure itself. One local farmer, a man known for his practical mindset, was the first to voice what others had only murmured privately. "What they say is true," he began cautiously. "That cabin really stays warm in this cold, then I have to see it for myself." He stepped forward, brushing snow from his coat, and entered the doorway. The warmth hit him immediately, and he instinctively rubbed his arms, feeling the difference between the bitter winter air outside and the surprisingly comfortable interior. His eyes widened as he noticed the careful layering of stones, moss, and timber. How is this possible?" he asked, disbelief and admiration mingling in his voice. The man inside the cabin smiled quietly. "It is all about understanding the materials and how they interact with the environment," he explained. He guided the visitors through the interior, pointing out the thick walls, the central hearth, and the small vents that allowed smoke to escape while retaining heat. He demonstrated how the thermal mass of the stone absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly, and how insulation using moss and clay minimized drafts. The villagers listened intently, some still skeptical, others increasingly impressed. They had spent winters struggling in their conventional cabins, reliant on small fires and thin walls, and the concept of a space 20 degrees warmer than the outside air seemed almost magical. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, more neighbors had arrived, some cautiously, some openly fascinated. They came to witness the phenomenon firsthand, to feel the warmth, and to ask questions about construction, insulation, and materials. The cabin, once a source of ridicule, had become a topic of conversation throughout the valley. Children led the way, eager to show their parents the alcoves, the hearth, and the clever use of ancient stones. Adults observed carefully, measuring, comparing, and asking about details they had never considered in their own homes. Slowly, admiration replaced doubt. The man had achieved something remarkable. He had taken centuries-old ruins and transformed them into a functional, comfortable living space that defied the harshest winter conditions. He took time to explain the science behind the cabin in simple terms. The thick stone walls, he said, acted as thermal mass, absorbing heat from sunlight and the hearth, and releasing it slowly throughout the day and night. The layered insulation of moss, clay, and timber trapped warmth effectively, while allowing the walls to breathe, preventing moisture buildup, and maintaining stability. Ventilation was carefully managed, ensuring that smoke from the hearth escaped without letting precious heat out. Even the positioning of the cabin within the ruins had been deliberate, maximizing exposure to weak sunlight and shielding against the harshest winds. As he spoke, the neighbors nodded, some taking notes, others simply marveling at the ingenuity. One neighbor, a woman known for her practical wisdom, raised a question. Could this method work in my cabin? I struggle every winter to keep it warm. He nodded, explaining how the principles could be adapted to other structures, thermal mass, insulation, and strategic placement of openings. He emphasized that the key was careful observation of the environment and understanding how materials responded to heat and cold. The villagers listened intently, beginning to grasp the idea that warmth was not merely a matter of firewood or fuel, but of thoughtful design and adaptation. The protagonist also demonstrated small experiments to illustrate his point. He lit a small fire in one corner and measured how quickly the stone walls absorbed heat, noting the time it took for temperature to rise throughout the interior. He showed how minor adjustments, closing a vent, adding an extra layer of moss, affected heat retention. Neighbors observed with increasing amazement, comparing the performance of the cabin to their own homes, which struggled to maintain warmth despite constant effort. By the end of these demonstrations, skepticism had largely given way to respect, and some villagers began to see the potential of integrating similar techniques into their own winter preparations. Over the following weeks, the cabin became a hub of quiet activity. Children played inside the alcoves, enjoying the warmth while adults observed, took notes, and asked questions. Some brought firewood or supplies, eager to contribute in small ways. Others visited to learn from the man directly, seeking guidance on how to improve insulation or manage airflow in their own cabins. The once laughing neighbors now approached with curiosity, respect, and a willingness to learn. The transformation was subtle but profound. A single, carefully designed structure had shifted perceptions throughout the community, demonstrating that ancient wisdom combined with modern reasoning could yield tangible results. Evenings in the cabin were a time of reflection. He would sit near the hearth, observing how the flames danced against the stone walls, measuring temperatures, and noting subtle patterns in heat distribution. The neighbors' reactions had reinforced the significance of the project, but the work was far from complete. Adjustments were made continuously. Minor cracks were sealed with moss and clay. Insulation was added in vulnerable areas, and venting was fine-tuned to balance smoke escape with heat retention. Each observation and modification contributed to a growing understanding of how the cabin could function optimally in the harshest winter conditions. The cabin also demonstrated the psychological effects of warmth. Visitors consistently remarked not only on the physical comfort, but also on the sense of security and calm provided by the enclosed, stone-walled space. They lingered longer than expected, reluctant to return to the bitter cold outside. Even the most skeptical observers admitted that the warmth was remarkable, a tangible proof that careful planning, observation, and respect for materials could create comfort where none had been possible before. The cabin had become both a shelter and a symbol, a quiet testament to ingenuity, patience, and perseverance. He continued to document every detail meticulously. Temperatures were recorded at different times of day and night, airflow patterns noted, and minor adjustments cataloged. This information would serve not only for future improvements but also for sharing knowledge with others in the community. The cabin had become more than a personal project. It was a demonstration, an educational tool, and a living proof that innovation could thrive even in challenging conditions. Neighbors began to spread the word beyond the valley. Travelers and nearby villagers came to witness the cabin themselves, marveling at the warmth and the clever use of ancient ruins. Some asked for advice on replicating the techniques, while others simply observed in awe. Children, once the first to discover the warmth, now guided visitors, proud of their role in unveiling the cabin as secrets. The initial ridicule and laughter had faded entirely, replaced by curiosity, respect, and a sense of shared fascination. The protagonist reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. Months of planning, clearing, constructing, and observing had culminated in a cabin that not only provided warmth but also inspired a community. The ruins, long abandoned and forgotten, had been transformed into a space that bridged past and present, history and innovation. The principles he had applied, thermal mass, insulation, airflow, and strategic design, were simple in theory but had been executed with meticulous care. The result was undeniable, a cabin that stayed 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, even in the harshest winter conditions. As the first winter progressed, the cabin became a gathering place. Neighbors would stop by to check on progress, exchange ideas, or simply experience the warmth firsthand. Evenings were filled with quiet conversation, demonstrations of heating techniques, and shared reflection on the ingenuity of combining ancient materials with modern reasoning. The cabin had become a symbol of what could be achieved through observation, persistence, and respect for natural structures. By midwinter, the community had largely shifted in perception. Laughter had been replaced with admiration, skepticism with curiosity, and doubt with respect. The cabin's warmth was no longer surprising, it had become expected. A reliable sanctuary in the heart of winter. Children played within, adults learned, and the ruins, once silent and desolate, were alive with both physical warmth and the intangible warmth of communal curiosity and engagement. He continued to refine the cabin, testing subtle adjustments to improve heat retention, airflow, and structural stability. Each observation reinforced the lesson that living successfully in extreme conditions was not solely about resisting the cold, but about understanding and working with materials, design, and environment. By winter's peak, the cabin had not only survived, but thrived, offering a clear demonstration of the principles he had meticulously applied. Winter did not loosen its grip gently. It held on with a stubborn, grinding persistence, as if determined to test every stone of the cabin and every decision that had gone into its creation. Snow piled high against the outer walls of the ancient ruins, drifting into sculpted curves that glowed pale blue under moonlight. The valley fell quiet in the deep cold, a kind of silence that seemed to press against the ears. Yet within the thick embrace of stone and moss, warmth endured, not blazing, not wasteful, but steady, reliable, intentional. By the time the coldest stretch of winter arrived, the cabin was no longer an experiment. It was proof. Each morning he woke before dawn, the hearth reduced to glowing embers that still radiated faint heat into the surrounding stone. He would lie still for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind might be roaring across the ruins, rattling loose fragments of ancient masonry, but inside there was only the soft whisper of settling stone and the subtle crackle of cooling embers. The temperature difference was measurable, consistent, nearly 20 degrees warmer than the air beyond the doorway. He no longer checked it with disbelief. He checked it with quiet satisfaction. He rose carefully, feeding the hearth with a few split logs, not because the cabin demanded it desperately, but because maintaining equilibrium required gentle attention. The stones, thick and patient, absorbed the new warmth as they always did. He had learned their rhythm now. Heat did not rush through the space. It migrated slowly, settling into corners, flowing along walls, lingering in alcoves. The structure breathed in its own deliberate way. What surprised him most was not the warmth itself, but how little fuel it required compared to conventional cabins. Neighbors had once burned through stacks of wood in a single brutal week of winter, feeding thin wooden walls that leaked heat into the frozen night. His fire burned smaller, steadier. The thermal mass did the rest. The ancient builders, centuries ago, had understood something fundamental about endurance. He had simply listened. As midwinter deepened, visitors became more frequent. At first, they came in twos and threes, stamping snow from boots, ducking beneath the reinforced archway with cautious expressions. But the pattern shifted. They began staying longer. They brought questions. They brought notebooks of their own. One afternoon, a group of men who had once openly laughed at his efforts stood quietly along the interior wall, pressing gloved hands against stone warmed by the hearth hours earlier. Their skepticism had thinned into humility. "It does feel like winter in here," one admitted softly. He nodded. "It still is," he replied. "We just changed how we meet it." He began explaining, not with superiority, but with patience. He described thermal mass again, how stone absorbed energy slowly and released it gradually. He explained how insulation was not about sealing everything tight beyond reason, but about balancing retention with breathability. He showed them where moss had been layered between irregular stones, how clay sealed microdrafts without trapping moisture. He demonstrated the small vent system above the hearth that allowed smoke to escape, without pulling warm air violently upward. They listened this time. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes rippled through the valley. A farmer reinforced the north wall of his cabin with salvaged stones stacked along the exterior to create additional mass. A widow lined her sleeping corner with clay-sealed stone and moss after noticing how warmth lingered longest in those spaces inside the ruins. Someone repositioned a window to face the low southern winter sun more directly. None replicated the structure entirely. Each home had its own constraints, but principles traveled quietly from one roof to another. He observed this transformation with something close to disbelief. The ruins had once been dismissed as relics of irrelevance. Now they were teachers. There were setbacks too. A fierce blizzard struck in late January, hurling snow sideways in sheets so dense the world vanished beyond RMS reach. The wind found weaknesses no one had anticipated. It forced its way through an overlooked seam near the base of one wall, creating a faint but persistent draft. He noticed the temperature shift, immediately subtle but real. Instead of frustration, he felt a spark of gratitude. The structure was revealing where it could improve. When the storm calmed, he reinforced the seam with additional clay and moss, adding a carefully shaped stone wedge to redirect wind flow. He studied snowdrift patterns afterward, realizing the accumulation itself provided natural insulation when allowed to settle against exterior walls rather than being cleared too aggressively. Another lesson. Another refinement. The cabin evolved continuously, not through grand redesigns, but through attentive response. Psychologically, something changed within him as winter stretched on. Early in the project, the warmth had felt like defiance, a statement against ridicule. Now it felt like stewardship. He was not proving neighbors wrong anymore. He was demonstrating possibility. The laughter that once echoed across the snow had faded entirely, replaced by thoughtful conversation and collaborative curiosity. Children came often, drawn less by novelty now and more by comfort. They sat in the warm alcoves, reading borrowed books, or listening to stories of how ancient builders shaped stone without modern tools. He began speaking about orientation, about watching how shadows moved across walls throughout the year, about respecting land instead of overpowering it. One evening, as snow fell gently outside, a neighbor asked the question that had lingered unspoken. "Will you rebuild the entire ruins?" He looked around slowly at the weathered stone, the partial walls still open to the sky, the balance between shelter and history. "No," he said finally. "They need rebuilding, they needed listening." That distinction settled heavily in the room. By late winter, the temperature difference between inside and outside remained consistent even during the harshest cold snaps. Measurements taken over weeks confirmed what instinct had begun to accept. The cabin maintained an average of 20 degrees warmer than exterior air, with significantly reduced fuel consumption compared to nearby wooden cabins. But the greater impact was no longer numerical. The valley itself felt altered. People spoke differently about winter. Instead of dreading it purely as an adversary, they discussed how to adapt to it intelligently. They compared insulation techniques. They shared small innovations inspired by what they had seen inside the ruins. The mindset had shifted from endurance through suffering to resilience through understanding. As daylight hours slowly lengthened and the sun began climbing higher in the sky, the cabin responded. The southern wall absorbed more energy during the day, releasing it gently through the night. Snowmelt began tracing quiet lines along the outer stones, dripping rhythmically onto the frozen ground. The valley did not warm quickly, but it softened. He spent long afternoons documenting the entire winter, as data temperature logs, fuel usage comparisons, airflow observations, structural adjustments made after storms. His journal, once filled with speculative sketches, now held empirical record. The experiment was no longer theoretical, it was lived experience. He considered what might come next. Others had begun asking if he would help them adapt their homes before the next winter. Some even suggested forming small gatherings to study old building methods more deeply. The idea of a community workshop forming around ancient principles would have seemed absurd months ago. Now it felt inevitable. One particularly clear night near the end of winter, he stepped outside the cabin and stood in the ruins beneath a sky thick with stars. The air was still brutally cold, yet he felt no hostility from it anymore. He turned and looked at the cabin glowing faintly from within, stone walls carrying stored warmth like a memory of sunlight. The ruins had stood for centuries without him. They would stand for centuries after. What changed was not the stone, it was the relationship between people and place. When spring finally began its cautious arrival, it did not explode in green. It seeped in quietly. Snow thinned, patches of earth emerged. The wind lost its edge. Inside the cabin, warmth still held easily, now supplemented by longer daylight rather than constant fire. He reduced hearth usage gradually, observing how solar gain alone sustained comfort during afternoons. Another confirmation, another proof that design mattered more than brute force. Neighbors visited less frequently as chores shifted toward planning and preparation, but when they passed the ruins, they no longer smirked. They nodded. Some paused to exchange observations about modifications they had made to their own homes. A quiet network of shared learning had formed. The final measure of success came not from temperature readings, but from something simpler. When the last frost warning of the season passed, a neighbor who had once mocked him approached and said, "Next winter, I want to try adding stone along my north wall. Will you help me plan it?" There was no triumph in his reply, only calm agreement. As the valley transitioned fully into spring, the cabin remained integrated, unobtrusive, alive within ancient walls. It did not dominate the ruins. It belonged to them. He often sat in the doorway at dusk, watching light shift across stone surfaces that had witnessed generations long before his own. The lesson of the winter was clear in his mind. Innovation did not always mean invention. Sometimes it meant rediscovery, sometimes it meant humility. The warmth that had filled the cabin through months of ice and wind was more than thermal advantage. It was a reminder that survival did not require louder tools or thicker walls alone. It required observation, patience, and respect for what had already endured. The neighbors had laughed when he began. That memory felt distant now, almost irrelevant. What remained was a shared understanding that old wisdom, when paired with modern awareness, could transform hardship into opportunity. As birds returned to nest in the upper crevices of the ruins and green shoots pushed stubbornly through thawing ground, he closed his journal on the winter as final entry. The numbers were precise, the evidence undeniable, but the real legacy of the cabin was not measured in degrees. It was measured in perspective. The ruins were no longer abandoned relics of a forgotten era. They were living architecture again, teachers of resilience, guardians of warmth, proof that history still had lessons to offer those willing to listen. And when the next winter inevitably came, it would not be met with ridicule or fear. It would be met with understanding.